Estamos en la temática se puede todavía hablar de reinos orgánicos. Gayon es uno de los más destacados filósofos de la biología actualmente. No solo representa la tradición epistemológica francesa que valora altamente la historia de la ciencia y la investigación filosófica, tradición que ya viene del siglo XIX de bachillerato, sino que ha hecho de la tradición llamada continental se ha desarrollado en el campo de la filosofía y la biología en diálogo con la tradición llamada anglosajona. Gayon es especialista en temas amplios sobre el desarrollo del evolucionismo, no solo del Darwin, sino de los periodos progresionistas también. Ha venido a México en varias ocasiones, desde 1987, y más de una vez ha dictado la Conferencia inaugural de Evolución Darwin, que se celebró en 2009, y ha desarrollado sobre el cine de los reinos orgánicos. Bienvenido, doctor Gayon.
Es que el técnico ha desaparecido.
Muchas gracias a los realizadores y al público. ¿Me entiende bien?
Sí.
Sí. No. Discúlpeme porque voy a hablar en inglés. Estaría para el público si no hablaría en español. Yes, the kingdoms of nature, a very old notion in natural history, and I will try to show that there is a for this colloquy. What is the problem? It's for me a new subject that I'm exploring, so I'm taking some risks, and I hope this will have a discussion when it will come. But for the discussion, I will accept questions in Spanish or English or French and try to answer in Spanish if I can. What's the problem? Well, in biological classification, for approximately 3 centuries and a half, kingdoms, reinos in Spanish, represent the highest traditional taxonomic ranks. Here is an example of the traditional ranks in biological classification. This is called the extended linear hierarchy. This is called the extended linear hierarchy. Well, all the categories could be either in between or below. The idea is that the living world can be divided in boxes which contain small boxes and smaller boxes, etc., with in principle no overlap. In red here, you can read the most currently used taxonomical categories, and I give example. I give examples here. For instance, an example of kingdom is animals. It could be plants, and within animals you have a phylum of vertebrates. Within this you have mammals, etc., etc., down to Homo sapiens and Homo sapiens sapiens. Okay. Well, of course, taxonomic ranks have always been a matter of convention. New categories can be added. They can be above or below a given one. For instance, if you have a given genus, you can have a subgenus or a supergenus. It's also conventional in the sense that the ascription of a given category to a given taxon, for instance, saying that Homo sapiens is a species, well, the ascriptions of ranks is regularly revised in the history of biology. Thus, in a sense, well, there is no special problem for the kingdoms. For instance, super kingdoms or sub-kingdoms have been sometimes introduced in some groups. However, there are indeed a number of special problems raised by kingdoms. Well, first, as you have seen in my list, kingdoms occupy a special position because they are at the highest point. They are the highest possible divisions of life, just as the species, for instance, Homo sapiens, is also at one extremity, but the other one, they are the lowest, the lowest possible category. Species are the most elementary units. Kingdoms are the most comprehensive categories. Thus, it matters to know how many kingdoms there are and what they are, and more than that, whether this question is meaningful. I will show in this talk that this question has taken a spectacular shift in recent biology through the discussion over the fundamental domains of life. In fact, well, for decades, biologists have said, well, it's useful to have taxonomic categories and kingdoms, why not? But in fact, it's not an important question. And I will show that in a certain sense, the most difficult questions raised by kingdoms in the 18th century are still there, but they've shifted to new formulations. Another thing I would like to say in this introduction, and this will be quite important, is that modern systematics is more interested in genealogical arrangement of taxa than in taxonomic ranks, currently considered as arbitrary. Nevertheless, I will try and show that the modern discussions over the most fundamental divisions of life
challenge this traditional position in contemporary biology. The current emphasis on genealogy is reflected in the debates among evolutionary biologists between clades. Clades are lineages, they are genealogical groupings, and grades. Grades meaning a spatial level of organization. So then the question becomes, well, should the most comprehensive domains of life, also called kingdoms by some authors today, or also domains of life, well, can they be understood as clades? So do they fit with the general approach to biological systematic? Well, if yes, well, for instance, if prokaryotes and eukaryotes are clades, are they originary, or do they originate from something else, and what does that mean? So this is a question that I will discuss in the last part of my talk. Correlatively, because I think the answer is no, are these most fundamental divisions of life today, are they free of any sort of evaluation in terms of a degree of organization? So what is reflected by the term grade in modern biology? Are they free of anything like a reference to evolutionary progress? Can they be thought exclusively in terms of clades or not? This is the challenge. And how far? Well, how far do the present divisions of life, prokaryotes, archaea, eukaryotes, or other, imply a real change in comparison with the former kingdoms of nature? So now here you have a picture, general picture. I've been rather imprecise, but I've introduced a number of concepts that will be discussed in the course of this talk. The first part of my talk will be historical. I will just describe and interpret what were called the kingdoms of nature in the 18th century mainly. Then I will show how this notion of kingdoms of nature was progressively dissolved in the 19th and the 20th century. And I will finally comment on present debates of what is called the domains of life, which is the new figure, the new of what was formerly called kingdoms. So, kingdoms of nature. That's an ambitious name, kingdoms of nature. In fact, well, this introduction was diffused and theorized and made so prominent by Carl Linnaeus in his Systema Naturae, System of Nature, in 1735. It's a very small book. I will comment a little more on this later on. In this very small book, 11 pages, there is a paragraph entitled Observations on the Three Kingdoms of Nature. It's in Latin, of course, and I've translated into English here. And then within this paragraph, you have two short articles, and the whole book is redacted in that way. It's a very straightforward way for Linnaeus to formulate his method. Then he says, well, Article 14, natural bodies divide into three kingdoms of nature: the lapidary kingdom, that is minerals, stones, etc., the vegetal kingdom, plants, and the animal kingdom, animals. And for Linnaeus, this is eternal. These are natural kinds. And in Article 15, he is a little more precise. Stones grow, plants grow and live, animals, I'm sorry for this, animals grow, live, and fill. Such are the frontiers within which these kingdoms are constituted. Well, of course, you can recognize an Aristotelian tone in this formula, except for the stones. It's just like, well, you had another property, such as for instance, life or feeling, and then you have another kingdom. So here is the first page of Linnaeus' System of Nature. As I say, the first edition had 11 pages. There were 13 editions in the course of the life of Linnaeus. The last edition had, I'm sorry, it's 1770, it's 3,000 pages. So, here is the origin of the notion of kingdoms of nature. Well, what happened after that? I will just spell out a few general tendencies. Well, first, Linnaeus thought that minerals and stones could be classified according to the same method used for plants and animals. That is, a hierarchical classification based on similarities and difference of beings that all grow. And of course, as early as the end of the 18th century, the idea that stones grow became an obsolete notion. In fact, while Linnaeus' conception of mineral classification had no posterity, it was superseded by new methods in chemistry and crystallography mainly. Thus, well, except in the ordinary language, the notion of a mineral kingdom existing on a par with the plants, animals, quickly disappeared. So early in the 19th century, it became clear that the notion of kingdom as a technical notion had to be used exclusively in the case of living beings. And then the kingdoms of nature became the organic kingdoms, which is something slightly different. It's more restrictive. Another major important change is that, well, although the plant and animals divide has remained strong quite late in the 19th century, the number of organic kingdoms has been subject to discussion. In fact, well, two main subjects were discussed all along the 19th century. Well, first, what about the protists? The protists are the unicellular organisms. They are incredibly numerous, complicated to classify and describe, etc., etc. So, well, quite quickly, in fact, around the 1860s, Ernst Haeckel, the German naturalist who was a sort of disciple of Darwin in Germany, proposed to introduce a new organic kingdom. That is, well, plants, animals, and protists. And this is reflected in this tree, which would require a lot of comments because it's so much confusing and there are so much errors in it. But well, I just show it. I will return on this diagram later on, but I just show it to show that for Haeckel there are not too many branches of life, but there are three: animals, plants, and protists. Well, the other main subject of discussion in the 19th century, and I think this can be interesting for this conference, is the status of man. Of course, I shouldn't say man. Well, if you say man in an academic area today, you say, well, man, you're a machist, you are, well, but people used to say man. Well, I could say humans if you want to. Well, no problem. Well, so what about man? So a number of authors in the 19th century, and this is still true today, say, well, we should have a special kingdom for man, for humans, because humans are so much different in many respects from any other organisms, you know, what cognitive capacities, eusociality, etc., cooperation, etc., that although they are very close to other primates in certain respects, one should make a special kingdom for them. I will just give 2 examples. First, this quotation from the French naturalist Armand de Quatrefages in an article whose title is quite explicit, on the human kingdom, sobre el reino humano, in 1866. I don't read the quotation, but it just tells you, well, we should recognize a 4th kingdom for, well, including humans and only humans. Another example is given, I won't give quotations here, but they're very spectacular too. Another example was Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection with Charles Darwin, who also said that humans should be erected at the level of perhaps a class, or higher, perhaps a kingdom. So you said that even in the 19th century, it was unclear that there were 2 kingdoms, animal, plants, or 3 at protist, or 4 at humans. I recapitulate what happened after Linnaeus. Well, so we see that we had a restriction of kingdoms to living beings, and then a tension between a purely taxonomic notion and a more or less evaluative notion. Some living beings have more than others. For instance, if you make an opposition between the protists and the others, the unicellular and the other, well, there is an idea of more complexity, maybe, I don't know. The same for plants and animals. Animals have capacities that plants do not have. Well, since I was trained as a botanist, I would probably not admit this, but this is quite a common idea. And animals are supposed to be much more complex, much more autonomous, much freer, much more, well, many more capacities. And also the case of human kingdom. I would like now to conclude on this part, to propose, it's a sort of digression. I would like to propose an anthropological interpretation of kingdoms in the old manner, based on the French anthropologist Louis Dumont. Louis Dumont was a remarkable specialist of Indian castes. He wrote a book entitled Homo Hierarchicus, the system of caste and its implication in 1966, which was an absolutely exceptional book, both from an empirical point of view and a theoretical point of view. What interests me in this book is the reflection that Dumont proposed after writing this book, and this was including in later editions, a sort of general reflection on the notion of hierarchy. Castes, Indian castes, offer an exceptional example of a social hierarchy. So what does mean hierarchy? And I find Dumont's reflection absolutely fascinating and quite unusual. What is the basic idea of underlying all possible hierarchies for Dumont? Dumont first say, well, most often hierarchies are thought of in terms of ordering, of power. You know, for instance, in an army or in an administration where someone commands to marshals or other people. But he says, well, hierarchy is a much more general notion. What the notion of hierarchy implies is a scale where lower entities, for instance, are included in the French. I didn't find a good English translation. When the lower entities are included, englobés, up, in the superior entities according to a regular gradation. That means, for instance, soldiers are included in the colonel, because the colonel, well, commanding hierarchies give a good examples of this, because at a certain level of interpretation, a chief includes her or his subordinates. But Dumont insisted that puede is just one example of hierarchy and perhaps not the most fundamental. So for Dumont, the original notion of hierarchy is hierarchy of dignity. And you can understand why I'm interested in this, because when we are concerned with kingdoms of nature, organic kingdoms, we're interested in grades. Ultimately, Dumont proposed to define hierarchy as a logical schema. I wouldn't be surprised that logicians, if there are logicians in the room, are there logicians here? There is one. Michel Bourdeau. Well, if there are logicians in this room, they will be appalled by what I will tell now. But well, I just want to present the Dumont speculation. He says hierarchy is essentially a relation of inclusion of the opposite. And since he was an anthropologist, and I will give an example shortly. So let me illustrate, and these are Dumont's drawings. The next drawing are not Dumont's drawing, but these are Dumont's drawing. Suppose that you have a world of discourse constituted of two classes, A and B. Then Dumont says there are only two, and with no overlapping, and nothing else in the universe. Then there are only two possible relations. This one, which is juxtaposition, and this one, which is inclusion. Nothing in between. Juxtaposition and inclusion of the opposite. Which means that B is a part of A, it's consubstantial to it shares the properties of A, and in a certain sense, B is identical to A. But in another sense, B is distinct because it's just a part, it's not the ensemble. So it opposes to the ensemble. This is what inclusion of the opposite means. And you say, well, what does that mean? Oh no, in fact, it's very simple. Take the example, well, the key example that Dumont liked so much. It is, well, the creation of Eve from Adam. Eve is made from a rib of Adam. So it's a part of Adam, but in a certain sense, Eve is identical, well, women are identical to men in a certain sense, but in another sense, they are the opposite. And Dumont says, well, this is reflected in many languages where the term man is both used for designating the ensemble constituted by males and female humans, and also just males. Inclusion of the opposite. Well, think of this, keep it. I will not develop much further when we will come to discussion on technical biological subjects. Well, this is the example of Adam and Eve. I do not insist. Now, I quit Dumont, and I will try to apply this to the traditional kingdoms of nature. Let us assume we are in the 19th century that the maximal description of organic kingdoms is 4 kingdoms. That is mineral, plants, animals, and humans. Well, some people would say just plants and animals, but it will not change much in the analysis. So what's the relation between these four entities? Well, this would be a relation of juxtaposition in Dumont's vocabulary, but obviously this doesn't work because humans are, well, according to our naturalistic mood, humans are animals. So they are part of animals. So, well, similarly, if living things are made of or derived from non-organic matter, then they are both included and distinct from the non-organic world. Then it's not only, there is not only a relation of juxtaposition between between the mineral world and the living world. So this is not an appropriate representation. So assuming the traditional way of thinking and using Dumont's logical schema, there are two possible hierarchical orders. Well, either this one, that is the mineral included, you know, in the vegetable world, included in the animals, included in humans, or humans included within the animal kingdom, within the vegetal kingdom, within the mineral kingdom. So these are the two possibilities. It's a sort of experiment, no more. Well, let us look at the first one. If you assume this kind of representation, then it's an order of decreasing dignity. Well, for us at least, even if it's anthropocentric, it's axiologically plausible. But it's of course unlikely from a naturalistic point of view. Animals are not differentiated from man, plants are not differentiated from animals, and the mineral world is not differentiated from the vegetal world in any possible sense of the word. The other way, the other possibility is, no, it's decreasing. It's decreasing, no, increasing, sorry, decreasing dignity, increasing dignity. This is more plausible. I do not insist. Well, if there are only two kingdoms, things get more complicated. I skip this. Conclusions of my first part, my historical part. Problems raised by kingdoms of nature, the traditional notion, are not only taxonomical, they are also axiological. And the other first conclusion I would like to draw is that the two kind of hierarchies, that is taxonomical and axiological, mix up in the scientific debate. I now come to the dissolution of organic kingdoms. In the 19th century and in most part of the 20th century, the traditional view is the following. Two organic kingdoms, plants and animals, characterized by distinctive properties. This was the traditional view, but this is also, this traditional view were clearly challenged for three reasons. Well, first, there is no clear distinction between plants and animals. Second, in the course of the 20th century, the animal-plant divide has been replaced by another more fundamental distinction that between prokaryote and eukaryote. And the last problem is the dominant paradigm in systematics. That is, classification should reflect genealogical history, clades, not grades. I will make these problems a little more explicit. No clear divide between plants and animals. This was a recurrent debate in the 19th century. That is, well, we think we know well what animals and plants are, but in fact, it doesn't work. Why doesn't it not work? Here is a description of what biologists traditionally think about the most important differences between plants and animals. There are some, for instance, plants are fixed to a substrate, they are attached to a substrate. Animals are free moving. Another one is, for instance, the existence of a cellulosic cell wall. This could be made more precise, but I will not do it here. And in animals, no resistant cell wall. Or else, plants ingest substances that are only gaseous or liquid under the form dissolved in water, whereas animals ingest nutrients that are mainly solid, for instance, organic matter or living beings. But in fact, there are exceptions to all these criteria. In fact, well, biologists do not say really that plants always live fixed to a substrate. It's in general, most of them. And if you say that animals are free moving, no, not always. Not always. Some are fixed. And it's the same for all the criteria. It's in general, most of them, etc., etc., etc. So you have so many, of course, these are borderline exceptions, but this means that animals and plants are not natural kinds in the sense of essences with an absolute divide between the two so-called kingdoms. Second challenge, the replacement of the animal-plant divide by something different. Well, the first step was the introduction of the kingdom of protists. Everything that did not fit with the animal-plant divide and that was unicellular was put in the protist. And this is, again, well, this is exemplified by Haeckel's tree, where there are so many strange things. For instance, just a few. In fact, one could comment almost every stair of this tree. For instance, if you look here, you have the sponges. Well, for us today, they are mostly pluricellular animals, not protists. Here, if you look at it, well, most people do not look precisely at what is in this tree. You have the name of two things that are now called bacteria. Okay? And here, it's Protomonas. It's in fact a protozoan. So there are many strange things in this tree. Nevertheless, the important thing is the key point is the introduction of a third kingdom. Okay. The second step came quite later on, 1937, the introduction of the prokaryote-eukaryote distinction by the French biologist Chaton. Well, this a distinction that was what was defended by the French Nobel Prize André Lvov later on. But this distinction remained confidential until approximately the mid-1960s, when two American biologists proposed to make it the fundamental division of life, prokaryotes, eukaryotes. Just to recall you, and without being too much technical, what prokaryote and eukaryote mean? Prokaryotes have basically prokaryotes have no nucleus. No nucleus, that is, the genome is not included in a sort of a small package with an internal membrane. And another important, many other differences, but another important difference is that prokaryotes have no organelles, no mitochondria, no plast, nothing that could resemble to symbiotic organisms that would have been phagocyted by other cells and integrated with these new cells. Well, you can observe that the classical definition of prokaryote is negative. Prokaryotes are always defined by negative properties. Isn't that strange? They are defined by negative properties in comparison with eukaryotes, who are more complex, more this, more that, and who are supposed to have appeared later. This looks like an order of dignity, to speak as Dumont. Well, evolutionary biologists would say a level of organization, say, a degree of organization, a degree of complexity. In fact, well, as I just said, in the 1960s, this distinction became the main divide. As Stanier and Vinyl said in 1962, the greatest single evolutionary discontinuity to be found in the present-day living world. That's impressive. No more animals and plants, but this. Okay? Note the ambiguity of this spectacular formula. Discontinuity in the present-day living world. They say evolutionary discontinuity, but in the present-day living world. Isn't that strange? Are we speaking of history or of levels of organization? Clades or grades? Note also the ambiguity around pro. A distinguished philosopher, a colleague of mine, Jan Saap, has commented a lot on this point. Pro, well, does it mean before? Meaning that eukaryotes would have originated in past eukaryotes. That has been the common understanding since 60 years. But it's not at all clear, not at all. Is it less complex, less, more complex, pro-eu, or before, after? This has been a major confusion in biology in the past half of a century. Well, Stanier believed that pro means the two. Prokaryotes are less complex, and they appeared first. But in fact, they had no argument, and they acknowledged it. In fact, if the eukaryotes were derived from the prokaryotes, then, I'm sorry to insist, prokaryotes are not a clade. That is a monophyletic lineage, but a grade. This is characteristic of the modern, the modern approach. If you want to think genealogically, you should be consistent. So if you say that prokaryotes are a clade, that is a lineage, a complex lineage, but then you should have an ancestor, the prokaryotes, and eukaryotes as a derivation, but eukaryotes should be still prokaryotes in the taxonomy. But it's not the case. Eukaryotes are distinct from prokaryotes. Here is an illustration. In fact, in the 1960s, this is a drawing from Ford Doolittle, a very well-known, very brilliant specialist of these issues. He says, in the 1960s, there were several possible ways of representing the relationship between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Well, this is what the first way is to say, well, we have two classes of organisms. We don't bother about history, about evolution, but we have two levels of organization, that's all. The second way is to say, well, eukaryotes came from prokaryotes. But there was also a third possibility, that is, prokaryotes and eukaryotes have different origins. In fact, in the 1960s, one didn't know. And I would say that even today, it's very much unclear that we have secure knowledge about this. Last challenge to the traditional plant-animal divide. Well, in modern systematics, well, the dominant school is cladistics, or phylogenetic systematics. And the slogan is clades, not grades. That is only monophyletic groups, no paraphyletic nor polyphyletic groups. I will return shortly to this notion. And in fact, well, this slogan has been fatal to the traditional notion of organism, of organic kingdoms. For instance, animals and plants cannot be the most fundamental evolutionary groups. They are only terminal branches, that's all. And we have a similar problem with prokaryotes and eukaryotes. If the eukaryotes are derived from an ancestral prokaryote, they are just a branch within a prokaryotic lineage. But this is not the case. Thus, prokaryotes do not include eukaryotes. Well, I'm sure that, well, for some of you, well, this will look quite strange, but this is the problem. It's evident, it's obvious, but we have been bred, we have been trained in a world where it's clear that prokaryotes and eukaryotes are both grades and clades. If you question this, well, then, well, you must face this paradox. I should explain what a paraphyletic group is. That is what the cladists the cladists refuse two things, paraphyletic and polyphyletic groups. I will define, give an example, and then applies to prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Paraphyletic groups. A paraphyletic group is a group that does not contain all the descendants of its common ancestor. For instance, consider a group that has been much criticized by modern systematics, the group of Reptilia, which is here in green. The group of Reptilia is made of some of the descendants of amniota. Mammals and birds are excluded. This is not a monophyletic lineage. You have just cut what you want in it in order to make it fit the needs of your theoretical or practical needs. Polyphyletic group. A polyphyletic group is characterized by one or several convergences or homoplasies, or in a more general sense, a polyphyletic group has multiple ancestral sources. So for instance, suppose that someone tells you it's interesting to isolate the lowland vertebrates. Okay, so that's it. You see that the specific origins of this are, in fact, twofold. This is a polyphyletic group. And cladists say, well, one should consider only monophyletic groups. This is a monophyletic group. This is another one. This is another one. This is another one, etc. Let us apply this to animals and plants. I'm just trying to tell you why the plant-animal divide disappeared as a fundamental description of the structure of the living world. If you look, I'm sorry, you don't have the full image here, if you could. No. No, it's not this one. Well, this is a representation of the universal tree of life with modern molecular methods. one among many other. And you see what you here, and the author, well, in most often in the universal trees of life that are presented today, animals and plants occupy just a small place. But here the author has been a little more explicit. He has made explicit what animals are in blue here and what plants are here. Okay, in this diagram you see that the whole group of protists is massively paraphyletic. Animals and plants, especially animals, are monophyletic. So they're not problematic for most authors. They are monophyletic, so they are good groups. But protists are what was called protists in the 19th and 20th century are massively paraphyletic. Here is another representation of the universal tree of life with contemporary data based on ribosomal RNA sequences. I just show you this diagram, but because here you see that well, animals and plants are just although they are so important for us, they are just two tiny bits in the general picture of the diversity of life. Well, this is perfectly obvious, but you see, we can no longer think of the living world in terms of animals, plants, and some other details that are just embarrassing. Last part, the domains of life. And here I acknowledge that I feel quite awkward because it's a kind of literature that I've explored only recently and which changes dramatically fast. So what we observe? Well, it's a story, in fact, it's a story longer than it looks because it began exactly in 1965. So half a century exactly. So what we observe, what we've been observing for 50 years is the molecular shift in our understanding of the structure, especially the genealogical structure of the living world. The molecular shift just consists in using molecular data and also all the possibilities offered by computers, for instance, comparing RNA sequences or DNA sequences for inferring universal trees of life. In fact, it should be underlined that before the, I should say, mid-60s and mainly the 1970s, there was no method permitting to map a phylogenetic tree of the entire living world. Of course, well, biologists sometimes like to draw trees representing everything in the living world, but these were just speculations. There was no method, no possibility to test the hypothesis, nothing, just conjectures. Of course, well, since Darwin, it was obvious that all biologists were interested in discovering the universal genealogical tree of life, but no method. And with molecular biology, it became possible to draw such universal trees of life. All of them are based on present living beings. So, well, the method consists in looking for bits of DNA or RNA that are supposed to be more stable than others, but which nevertheless change. You make comparison, and with just a bunch of method, you infer a phylogenetic trees. And today, well, he had a student who made a marvelous work, a biologist, on this, and who told me, but well, every biologist is able to make millions of different universal trees of life with the algorithms that exist today. Well, you just change a parameter and you obtain. So it's a real industry. You cannot imagine the enthusiasm that has surrounded this kind of research, and it's something that becomes popular, although it raises quite intriguing conceptual enigmas. So an entire field of research was opened, when I say 1960, no, not 1965, 1975, it's 40 years, no, not 50 years. An entire field of research was opened in fact, it's 1975, 6, 7, by Carl Woese and other colleagues. In that respect, I discovered recently, for biologists, of course, it would not be a discovery, but an incredible text that was published in 1977 by Carl Woese and a collaborator. Well, today, when students or when academics dispute about this, they want to have the most recent literature, and this is why I first tried to do. And in time, it becomes more and more complicated, and you understand nothing. And you have philosophers who come and who comment on the conceptual enigmas surrounding the trees that are produced. But I'm a philosopher and historian of science. And one of my major beliefs, it's more than a belief, it's a belief that has been, I think, confirmed by personal research, is that when something important happens in history of science, sometimes the clearest expression of the fundamental epistemological problems can be found in the seminal text. And this is a seminal text. This is not the text that prison biologists quote, because they have a little changed their vocabulary, and I will explain you why. But this text is incredibly, clear in its statements. Of course, you can disagree, but then you can say, well, in fact, for 40 years, what has happened? This is a sort of a reference point. So a remarkable paper where I would like you to observe the title: Phylogenetic Structure of the Prokaryotic Domain, the Primary Kingdoms. You couldn't have this today, I think, because the word kingdoms has been replaced by something else. I will tell you later. It's interesting to say that in perhaps one of the most important texts in the literature over 40 years, you have both domain and kingdoms. The old notion of kingdoms, the primary kingdoms. So what are Woese and Fox key assertions? So, well, methods: comparing DNA or RNA sequences, mainly RNA sequences. The aim, formula is bold, 1977, understanding the general phylogenetic structure of the prokaryotic domain. What are the key theses in this paper? If you're interested in this problem, please go to that paper. If you're making a PhD on this problem, do not read only the papers published between 2006 and 2015. Look at this one. So what does Woese, it's main Woese, what does he say? It comes at the beginning of the article. It's splendid because 40 years after, authors like Ford Doolittle, who is so much popular, is just saying exactly the same thing, saying, well, nobody has ever seen this, but it's so simple. No, in fact, Woese, in his seminal article, was saying in 1977, the eukaryote, prokaryote, I think it's distinction here. No. In fact, it's eukaryote, prokaryote, I should not have put the here. Eukaryote, prokaryote is not primarily a phylogenetic distinction. Interesting. Although it is generally treated so. Okay. And what is the reason for this? It's that what should be compared is not prokaryotes with eukaryotes, but prokaryotes with organelles within eukaryotes. Because, well, there is a consensus today about eukaryotes. They all have organelles, mitochondria, chloroplasts, and other things like that. And the consensus is that these organelles, which have a membrane within the cytoplasm of the cell, are former endosymbionts, that is, the result of a fusion or phagocytosis by certain cells of other prokaryotes. And then, well, another assertion in this paper is that the prokaryotes should be seen. It's very strange. I go a little more slowly because the prokaryotes should be seen as a domain rather than as a monophyletic lineage comprising several primary kingdoms. And the eukaryotes constitute another domain. This word domain is very strange. It's a way for Woozy, it's a way of saying stop thinking about prokaryotes and eukaryotes in terms of monophyletic lineages, in terms of clades. Think of, it's the expression he uses. Think them as levels of organization, and with the idea that the evolutionary story can be very complex, in fact. So there are levels of organization. He doesn't say grades, but I think this word should apply. Now, what is the main result of the legendary 1977 paper, often referred to, almost never quoted? There are three primary kingdoms. Within this domain of the prokaryote, there are three primary kingdoms. The typical bacteria. Well, don't tell me to make you a course on this now. It would require, for a philosopher, it would require certain preparation. Archaeobacteria, that is strange unicellular organisms that live in very extreme environment, especially in the oceans, with a metabolism totally different from the bacteria. They have no nucleus. They contain no organelles as bacteria, but they are quite different. And eukaryotic organelles. So the three primary kingdoms are bacteria, archaea, and not eukaryotes, but eukaryotic organelles, parts of eukaryotes. Okay? This is the 1977 paper. And Woozy say these three groupings are distinct kingdoms. Why does he need to go and fetch this old name that goes back to Linnaeus? Each one represents an independent evolution of the prokaryotic level of organization. And Woozy says, well, think that these bacteria have been living for more than 3 billion years without changing much. So, well, evolution, yes, but perhaps a very strong partition of life. What happened after? And I come to the end of this paper. In the years, in fact, well, my primary intent was to devote the entire paper to this debate. And this, you will have it in 2 minutes. Because perhaps I'm lazy, it was too complicated, and so I decided to go just to the sort of overview with the present state of knowledge. In the years after 1977, the three primary kingdoms conjecture was renamed the three domains hypothesis. And this is what you read in the literature now. Authors say there are three domains. Typical bacteria, eubacteria, archaebacteria, and eukaryotes. not eukaryotes, organelles. It's an interesting shift, very interesting shift. I don't know how to interpret this. I think that this reflects the difficulty of thinking of these groups in purely phylogenetic terms. Now, the further history. In 2014, a remarkable review article was published in Nature Reviews Microbiology by James McInerney and some colleagues, who tried to recapitulate the debate that has developed over 40 years. It's rare to have such clear articles in literature which is incredibly complicated and disappointing for the layman. And so McInerney says, well, in fact, over 40 years, 4 main hypotheses have been developed. There are others, but well, they are marginal. This is a very schematic representation, much more schematic than, you know, pictures with many names of taxons. It's really theoretical. The 3 domains hypothesis: eubacteria, archaeobacteria, or archaeas, and eukaryota. And here, of course, while you have an unknown origin, nobody can tell where all this comes from. You are just facing this, and you have eubacteria, then another branch which soon presents a bifurcation between archaeobacteria and eukaryota. Okay, thus 3 primary monophyletic lineages of ancient origins. That's Wurzer's hypothesis. Second hypothesis that has been fiercely discussed in the mid-2000, between 2000 and 2010. Eukaryotes early hypothesis. Well, this is really fantastic. Also, but it would be so nice if it were true. For the philosopher, it would be nice. But in fact, well, it has been clearly disproved. The eukaryotes early hypothesis consists in saying that all these 3 domains came from a sort of pro-eukaryotes with organelles and nucleus, and archaeobacteria and eubacteria evolved through a loss, a reduction of the nucleus or other things. This would be a terrific enigma, because this would mean that the most ancient was more complex than what came after, except for the eukaryota proper. But this has been clearly disproved, if I trust the specialists. Third hypothesis, well, I don't comment on this name, but the third hypothesis consists in saying that you have a eubacteria and another bifurcation with archaeobacteria, and within the archaeobacteria, the eukaryota finally emerged. And the last hypothesis, which is in fact the hypothesis of the author, so you can imagine that the arguments are much more elaborated than for the others in the paper. It's the ring of life hypothesis, which consists in saying that, in fact, eukaryotes emerged from the merging, the fusion of 2 lineages of prokaryotes, one consisting of eubacteria and one consisting of archaeobacteria. A funny thing in this scenario, well, in this scenario, eukaryotes are a secondary grouping. It's not a primary domain of life. It's secondary. And then there are not 3 primary groupings, 3 domains, like Wurzer said, but only 2. These 2, and this one came further through events of fusion. An interesting point, puzzling point, is that in this schema, when you go further into the details, the only monophyletic group is eukaryota. Although it was born from a fusion, from a sort of maybe a symbiosis or phagocytosis, we don't know. It's the only that is monophyletic. The two others are not monophyletic. They are either paraphyletic or polyphyletic, but they are not good for cladists, for instance. In fact, well, to end the story, there is no consensus today, but the merger hypothesis, the last one that I just exposed, seems to be the favored one now. I say seems to. Well, you know, cannot say that it's true. It's the work of the scientists just to eliminate the wrong hypothesis and to keep the most testable one. This fascinating debate shows the difficulty, I believe, to represent the ultimate primary kingdoms or domain of life in a purely genealogical way. For the epistemologist that I am, it's clear. You have a scientific debate where you have a community of investigators that say, well, the dominant paradigm in classification is genealogical, but here, at the foundations, at the basis of life, what we observe in the present state of knowledge, it's something different. Perhaps it's an effect of our ignorance. Perhaps not. We don't know. General conclusions. Well, first conclusion, the Linnaean essentialist vision of nature as divided into eternal kingdoms, mineral, plants, animal, is certainly dead, no doubt. With respect to the plant-animal distinction, although it's evolutionary consistent because these two are monophyletic groups for most authors, nevertheless, this distinction is obsolete as a representation of the most inclusive groupings of living beings. Thus, they are surely not primary kingdoms for modern biologists. Third conclusion, the present knowledge about the major divisions of life illustrate in a rather dramatic way the limits of a purely cladistic representation. In fact, well, as I just said, if I trust the authors, paraphily and polyphily, poly with an Y, affect the present taxonomy and evolutionary history of the prokaryotes. And as said by Doolittle, for Doolittle in 2013, a lot of confusion, it's almost a quotation, has resulted from the non-distinction between clades and crades by the specialists of the question. Therefore, in a sense, the notion of kingdom, understood as something stable through huge spans of time, is still plausible. Thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias, profesor. Tendríamos oportunidad para unas 3 intervenciones. Entonces, si alguien quiere participar, por favor, pedimos pues brevedad, concisión, no que llegamos a nuevos reinos, ¿no? Pero bueno, entonces, si alguien quiere participar. ¿Alguna pregunta? Sí, adelante.
Hola, muchas gracias por la presentación. Yo tengo una pregunta, es más bien como histórica. Linneo pues dividió la naturaleza en varios reinos y estas divisiones eran casi absolutas, ¿no? Pero al mismo tiempo Linneo tenía esta idea de que la naturaleza no daba saltos. ¿Cómo la naturaleza no daba saltos? No actuaba en saltos. ¿Cómo Linneo fue capaz de conciliar esta visión de la naturaleza dividida en reinos con esta otra idea de la naturaleza como algo que no que no da saltos, o que hay como una especie de continuidad habría ahí, no. Esa es mi pregunta.
No hay salto. Se puede entender eso en una manera temporal o en una manera clasificadora. Well, I'm sorry. From a historical or temporal view, it's clear for Linnaeus that taxa, especially species, do not transform themselves in other taxa. But in the same time, Linnaeus was so much interested in hybrids that he had personal experience of some sort of continuity between species. Well, I don't know what I can tell more. Perhaps we can discuss this afterwards.
Jan, en biología, el uso de la taxonomía y la filogenia, creo yo que siempre han sido hipótesis de trabajo. La propuesta de Linneo de sus 3 reinos o 4 reinos era una hipótesis de trabajo. En la medida en que el conocimiento humano ha venido teniendo herramientas para entender mejor a la naturaleza, hemos venido afinando nuestro entendimiento de la misma y la terminología para poderla describir. Ahora, con el advenimiento de la cladística y de la biología molecular, tenemos herramientas más precisas para tratar de entender la naturaleza, si la podemos agrupar en reinos o no como hipótesis de trabajo. El cambio taxonómico, el cambio filogenético o las propuestas que hacemos de taxonomía y filogenética cambian debido al desarrollo del conocimiento que tenemos. Cuando no podemos explicar algo, utilizamos términos un tanto confusos como dominio, por ahí. Cuando tenemos una herramienta más precisa, utilizamos clados. ¿Qué piensas tú a este respecto?
This is a big issue because what is at stake is the cognitive status of our knowledge. That is, are these just epistemological questions, that they are relative to our standards of knowledge, to our tools, to et cetera, or do they reflect a genuine order in the world? And then you would say, well, that if you accept this second stance, then you are a realist. Well, okay, well, I would admit that, well, anyway, well, everything always depends on the tools that we construct. Nevertheless, in this case, we might remember, Darwin's comments on classification in The Origin of Species. When he came to classification in the last chapter of The Origin, except for the conclusion, he said that if we think of biological classification in terms of genealogy, thus it means that we have a natural classification, not something that is a matter of convention, but this means that the real classification is the genealogical arrangement of taxa. And of course, well, perhaps we will be never able to reconstruct the true tree of life in Darwin's terms, but if there is a natural and objective classification, it should be genealogical. So in that sense, classification is not only a matter of convention, it's if it consists in genealogies of of taxa that evolve independently one from each other. That's a caveat. Then there is a sort of underlying structure of the living world that has to be discovered rather than invented or constructed. Okay, and this was the the interrogation behind this this talk. The cladists have taken this Darwinian slogan very seriously, because in fact they have built the method for reconstructing phylogenies. Darwin and his followers did not have a method. They just reinterpreted the older classifications in terms of genealogy. They did not have a genuine method. What I like in this debate is that, well, it shows that, well, there may be objective reasons why genealogy is not the ultimate word. Perhaps in some sense, the diversity of life contains some distinctions that are so strong across the evolutionary history that it's not just a matter of history. But I agree that, well, we always depend on the tools that we use, of course. I'm a historian of science, I'm sensitive to this, but never. This is why I insisted so much on clades and grades. Because all students today, well, I was, in fact, well, when I was a student in biology, well, people didn't even use clade and grade, but the way of thinking was a way partly genealogical and partly levels of organization, grades, and all this was mixed up. And with the present data and inferences over the origins, the big domains of life, we see that we are forced to think, biologists are forced to think more seriously about this. That is, well, the dominant paradigm, clades, no grades, is perhaps irrelevant at certain levels of the history of life. If you think of, of groups of animals, of group of plants, of course, well, grossly speaking, it works. It's not much beyond geology. But if you go to the roots of life, then it doesn't work. And I think there is something objective in this, not only epistemological.
Con respecto a la última pregunta sobre la precisión de las herramientas moleculares, hay que aclarar que en estos modelos que nos presenta el profesor Gayon sobre los tres grandes dominios de la vida, el diagrama cambia también según el tipo de genes con el cual se hace el trabajo. El trabajo original de Fox y Boyes, como nos recuerda muy bien el profesor, tiene que ver con los genes ribosomáticos. Cuando se toman en cuenta otros genes que tienen que ver con las maquinarias de replicación del ADN, o por otro lado genes que participan de procesos metabólicos, o por otro lado genes estructurales, los diagramas son diferentes y nos muestran entonces otro fenómeno que ha sido ilustrado muy bien por Cavalier Smith, y es de los grandes eventos de transferencias laterales de ADN y de información genética que ocurren en el mundo procariótico. En el mundo de los seres organizados sin núcleo, sin membranas nucleares y sin orgánicos internos. De tal manera que la última conclusión que dice el profesor Gayon, quiero reiterar sobre esto, en realidad es una cuestión bastante enmarañada cuando queremos ver estas raíces de las estructuras de la vida mucho más arcaicas y antiguas. De tal manera que una de las preguntas filosóficas que se pueden entender de ahí, primero, pues no hay una esencia como tal, ¿sí? Son registros de procesos muy arcaicos de transferencia génica lateral que tienen que ver con relaciones ecológicas en los organismos existentes en ese momento, en su mayoría, pues de tipo procariótico, sean de tipo arquea o de tipo eubacteria. Y por último, eso quería decir que es una propuesta que está surgiendo hoy en día, y es que la evolución de ese mundo microscópico y microbiano, tal como señala hoy en día Eugene Kuhn y otros autores, probablemente no siga el esquema darwiniano clásico, porque aquellas entidades que evolucionan no las podemos definir claramente, sino lo que podemos es hablar de una serie de interacciones y de transferencias laterales de información que hacen que la conclusión de Cavalier-Smith, a pesar de haber documentado altamente ese proceso, sea de que en términos puramente pragmáticos podemos aceptar los grandes dominios, pero señalando que no es suficiente el análisis molecular, que tenemos que tener en cuenta la organización celular, la estructura de los organelos, el grado de organización, para aceptar que en el fondo sí existen procariotes, tanto como bacterias, como arqueobacterias y como eucariotes. Y el mundo eucariótico pues también con las grandes diferenciaciones internas que eso podría tener. Pero lo que quería
Well, I totally agree. Thank you for the precisions you give. Well, tree, network, lateral gene transfer, symbiosis, etc. Well, that is part of the problem. In fact, well, there is a sort of, just in a word, if the traditional view that the traditional cladistic view is in a sense an essentialist one. So the cladists want to reconstruct the true tree of life, provided that there are lineages of species that are isolated one from the other. Then, although it's historical, it's a classification based on a succession of events. It's essentialist in the sense that if you succeed in discovering the true genealogy, then there is one and only one, and in a sense, it's something that is eternal, that is Parmenidean. But once you have lateral gene transfer and all sorts of mode of exchange, you don't have this representation of a branch, just a branching tree, but a branching tree of organisms with transfer of many things. But I would insist that nevertheless that, even though lateral gene transfer may be extremely important in eukaryotes and archaeas, then nevertheless it's still relevant to speak of a tree of organisms, or at least a tree of species.
Haríamos un breve receso de unos 15-20 minutos, como mucho 15 minutos, para poder seguir con la siguiente sesión y que no nos falle la cita.